To demonstrate synthesis, let's go back to our example of the narcoleptic cab driver. But first, let's take a look at some of the other relevant case opinions from that jurisdiction. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause this video and read this new case that I've put up on the screen. And while the video is paused, go ahead and maybe skim Cohen versus Petty once more, too, so that you can refresh your memory of that case. So skim over Cohen versus Petty, and then read this new case, and then come back to this video. So go ahead and pause this video now. So now we know that there are at least two cases in the District of Columbia. We'll assume that this case number 2 is also from the District of Columbia. So we know that there are at least two cases in the District of Columbia that are relevant to our question of whether the narcoleptic cab driver is liable for his passengers' injuries. We already knew about the first case, right? The first case was Cohen versus Petty. And that's the case that gave us the rule that says, well, if a driver is suddenly stricken by an illness that makes it impossible for him to control the car, and which he had no reason to anticipate would occur while he was driving, well, that driver is not chargeable with negligence. It wouldn't be right. It's not fair to charge him with negligence if he couldn't control the car and he had no reason to think that he'd get sick in that way. But this second case, G versus Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, this second case, it actually adds a caveat to that Cohen versus Petty rule. So in this case, in G, the court points out that if the defendant is an operator of a public common carrier, then the defendant is held to a higher standard of care, right? And in that case, becoming unexpectedly and suddenly ill, that doesn't relieve the defendant of liability. To avoid liability, the common carrier must have had some reasonable fail-safe procedures in place to avoid injuries in the event of an unexpected illness. So this case is tackling our issue from a slightly different angle, and it's clarifying the Cohen versus Petty rule. So the Cohen versus Petty rule may be the general rule, but as we know now from G, doesn't apply to public common carriers. The operator of a public common carrier will be held to a higher standard of care. So that's good information for us to know. Now let's take a look at another case. All right, so go ahead and pause this video and read over this third case. Go ahead and pause the video now. So this third case, Flagg versus Ciccarelli, this case clarifies the higher standard of care for common carriers. And it does that by letting us know that a defendant common carrier is only held to the higher standard. It's only held to the higher standard if the defendant was actually operating in the usual scope of operation. Right? Only if he was acting in the usual scope of operation, well, at the time of the accident. So a defendant common carrier is held to the higher standard, but only if the defendant was actually operating in the usual scope of operation of a public common carrier at the time of the accident. Otherwise, the regular Cohen rule applies. We don't have a higher standard. So just because you're in a bus or a taxi doesn't mean that the higher standard of care for common carriers automatically applies. If you are not a fare-paying customer of a bus or a taxi. So say you're a friend of the driver, and the driver is just giving you a lift home after the end of his shift. All right? Well, in that case, it's just as if you were in the driver's personal vehicle. The higher standard that's imposed on common carriers doesn't apply. So we seem now to have three different rules here. Right? We had case 1, Cohen versus Petty, case 2, the G case, and now case 3, the Flagg case. And all three of these address this question of whether a suddenly ill driver is chargeable with negligence. But they all tackle the issue from a slightly different angle. That means to do our analysis properly of the narcoleptic cab driver problem, we need to synthesize an overall rule that incorporates all of these rules and lets us reach the proper conclusion in our case.